First, just a quick word on the title I chose. It's a little bit was a little bit of a provocation, but I was inspired to use this title by a quote from Maxim Gorky, who already came up when I think it was in Tom's presentation about when he mentioned socialist realism. Of course, Gorky is well known as one of the promoters of folklore in literature in the 1930s. This is a quote from Gorky from 1909. The people are collectively the first and foremost philosopher and poet, creator of all the great poems that exist, all the tragedies in the world, and greatest among these tragedies, the history of world culture.
Sorry for interrupting. Are you screen sharing?
No,
you...
no.
No, so that's fine then.
I'll just be reading.
You
So
were reading. That's okay.
yeah. So you can listen in, and yeah, that's I have a oral tradition to promote here instead of the visual tradition, written word. So there are a couple interesting things about this quote just to get started. One is to note that this is from 1909, when Gorky is already a convinced socialist, but is far earlier than even the existence of the Soviet Union. And this is soon after the Bolshevik Party was just formed. So this connection, this is one of the earlier connections between a notion of folk poetics and socialist politics before the later articulation of it in much more extensive and specific terms in the Soviet period. The second point is that Gorky, by calling the folk or the people a philosopher, he points to the way in which in socialist and later communist thought the idea of the folk was not only important as a creator of images or national forms or perhaps national content, but also as an intellectual figure. And I want to get into this intellectual dimension of the idea of folklore and the folk. And third is how Gorky mentions this notion of tragedy, that the folk creates and is involved in all the tragedies of the world, including the history of world culture as a tragedy, which I think points to something that I'll describe a little bit later in more detail, but a sense in which, in this conception, the idea of the folk is connected to a heroic struggle to overcome contradiction and separation, which is part of what I think is implicit in the notion of tragedy, is a society full of contradiction that people push against and try to overcome, even when it seems impossible to overcome and might end badly. But I'll come back to that soon. Now, to get into the more specifics of how I want to frame my argument, I'm presenting my own analysis somewhat polemically against what I see as a way of the connection between communist folkloristics and folklore. So the communist tradition and folkloristics as a separate tradition is often in the literature and especially in non-scholarly approaches is presented or understood as a kind of enigma, a sort of historical particularity, because we have these two traditions that seem to be, on the face of it, so different that that it's strange to see them together. There's communism, which is understood to be historically modernist and emphasizing urban civilization, internationalist, versus folklore, which is seen to be historically connected to the past, connected to rural societies, and connected to nationalist political programs. And so how is it possible that these two things came together ever? And I want to push back against this way of treating their connection as an enigma or a particularity, and rather try to look for what might be some elective affinities between them, some structural reasons that folklore fit into communist political thought in certain important ways. I think it's striking that we would see it as strange that they come together when what this thing that is seen as strange is not just a specific, maybe temporary connection that happened in one small time and place, but is arguably the most extensive coordinated public intervention in support of folklore that's ever been undertaken in history. So if this huge undertaking, is it really enough to understand it as a sort of result of happenstance and political convenience at one specific moment? Of course, political convenience comes into play, but I think there might be something a little bit deeper involved here. But I think this structural elective affinity between communist politics and folklore research and revival, it might have been obscured a bit by this tendency, especially in the post-communist period, to look for an explanation based on specific contingent factors, rather than to interpret communist folkloristics as a system of thought and an intellectual contribution that can be critically understood, but also taken seriously as a system of thought in its own right, and to look at what folklorists wrote and said in the communist period in the context of official communist thought as real interesting ideas that deserve a kind of critical engagement. And now, so it's true on the one hand that when the communist tradition became so interested in folklore and and lent so much support to it, this was innovative in the history of socialism, in the sense that socialist movements previously had often skirted the boundaries of being interested in folklore, used other terms to address it, whereas at the same time, folklorists also, although some historically important folklorists in the 19th century had socialist sympathies, many more of them didn't or weren't directly involved in organized socialist movements. So there was something new taking place in the 30s when folklore became such a flag-bearing feature of communist political thought. But at the same time, what was happening in the 1930s was also in some ways a logical development of some long-standing elements of socialist thought that had been dealing for a long time with a series of tensions between the sense that socialism should involve both radical transformation and a kind of respect for long-term lived experience that the masses actually have experienced in their lives. At the same time, this perceived need that the socialist movement should be about global solidarity, but should also support local self-determination. It should advocate active participation of the masses, but also look for appropriate forms of representation and leadership. And so these were tensions that various thinkers tried to resolve in various ways. But in the field of culture, this led to a lot of, even before the great emphasis on folklore as such in name in the 1930s, this led to a series of other parallel or precursor attempts to deal with these tensions, like the emphasis on popular culture or proletarian culture or mass culture that were taken up at various other moments. And then the specific form that communist folklore and folkloristics takes in the 1930s and later through series of changes again. This specific form also reflects the specific structure of Soviet and Soviet-bloc thinking and the social system in which it emerged. And what I want to argue is that what made folklore so valuable to the communist project was that it mediated a kind of vision of the future that could be modeled on the ideal of a folk society while still emphasizing that there was something new, that and so folklore became a kind of point between the old and the new, between the city and the country, between the masses and their leaders, and that would and participation in folklore as a practice then could offer a kind of experience of mass participation and active participation. And I want to get into a little bit more later of what I understand that to mean in this context of communist thought on folklore. But there's one other aspect of this that I want to emphasize, which is that while I fully agree with the importance of the national question in the way folklore was framed and why folklore became important for communist policy, I also want to make a case for paying more attention to the so-called socialist content of folklore, and to look at how the significance of folklore went beyond the national question and also lay in this principle of mass participation and the possibility of bridging long-standing social divides between people and between spheres of society. And now the material that I will only be able to briefly get into here is based on a series of seminars, international seminars that took place in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s and 80s. So the context is partly Slovak and Czech, but also these seminars involved scholars from the entire Soviet bloc. And so I'm going to be trying to generalize a bit to look at to reconstruct a Soviet bloc folklore thought as some kind of a whole, although I think we should certainly also take into account the differences between these local contexts. And now what I'm going to be looking at are not classic texts by Soviet bloc folklorists, but texts that emphasize what kinds of responses these folklorists made when they were called upon in the context of these conferences, for example, to address this specific question of what folklore should be, what the significance of folklore is in the modern socialist world. So all of these conferences that took place, these 5 seminars, they were all themed on social folklore in modern society, folklore in socialist society, folklore festivals rather than traditional folklore in villages. This was the way they were all framed. And so I think maybe by looking at this body of thought, we can go beyond the analysis that just rejects communist folklore as connected to totalitarianism as a whole, and look more specifically at where its problems, but also maybe some interesting thoughts emerged. And I also would suggest maybe trying to get beyond what I see as two ways of looking at communist folkloristics that have sometimes emerged in the history of studies of this discipline, going back especially to the 80s and 90s when this became a more of a topic of research in the early period, when one of the emphases was on how ethnology and folklore studies functioned as propaganda tools of ruling regimes, which they certainly did, but at the same time, this emphasis made it harder to treat folklorists themselves as autonomous agents who had their own thoughts, even if we know that these thoughts were not always formulated in conditions of pure freedom. But I also then would push against this alternative view that would try to find a kind of a purely apolitical scientific scholarly core that can be separated from socialist politics, and to look at the pure scholarship that was valuably done in the socialist Soviet period without taking Soviet and socialist politics into account. So I think there's room to look for both an element of autonomy and interesting thought without ignoring and bracketing this socialist element of this body of thought. Now, to look a little bit into some of the specific contributions to these debates that were going on in the seminars that I've been researching. I'll start with one participant in a 1978 seminar in Slovakia, who was a man named Jan Melek, who's a representative of Slovakia's Institute for Popular Cultural Education. So he's more of a representative of a state institution than a scholarly folklorist. And in his presentation at this conference, he emphasizes that while there was an enormous quantitative growth in folklore activity since the communist power took party in Czechoslovakia in 1948, he estimates a 21-fold increase in the number of members of folklore ensembles from 1948 to 1978. What he says is important now is to deepen the socialist content of folklore. So this socialist content is explicitly emphasized in his talk. But it's interesting to look at what he considered to be the socialist content of folklore, because he doesn't then go on to advocate folklore performance that would say involve songs about collective farms, or that would praise the leaders, the general secretary, and so on. The kind of so-called Soviet folklore that we know was conducted in especially the 1940s and 50s. This was generally de-emphasized in the post-Stalin period, and there was a consensus among official folklorists in Czechoslovakia, especially, that wasn't really the right way to go. That folklore should emphasize this connection with traditional folklore. It's not good, it's not effective as propaganda. They would even say that directly. And yet the socialist content is still important. So what Melek goes on to say is, what he emphasizes is what he calls the development of the human personality, quote, end quote. And he says that this can be done by involving large numbers of people in the process of active cultural creation. So what I would take from this is that for him, the socialist content of folklore was its form, insofar as the organized folklore movement enabled masses to collectively realize their human potential for creativity. And this potential for creativity then was what they could be understood as the goal of the socialist project. And I think in this context, it's also worth keeping in mind that there was the Russian term for mass participation as in popular cultural activity was known as, if I'm reading the Russian right, художественная самодеятельность. self-activity, samodeятельность, I think is a really interesting term for this. The Czech and Slovak term is a bit different, emphasizing amateur, sort of popular engagement. But it's in some sense a claim that through folklore and other kinds of self-activity, which also involved, let's say, popular theater and dance classes and other things like this, but folklore being kind of the flagship of this self-activity, the aesthetic realm could carry out what was also supposed to be happening in the political and economic realms, that the people should take control of its history and society. So yeah, I actually didn't remember exactly what time I started speaking, so I have I'm not sure how much time I have left.
Yeah, sorry, that's not your fault, definitely. We are just running because of the debate. But if you briefly can conclude, or if it's
Okay.
possible, sorry for that.
Yeah, I just forgot to look at my watch when I was starting. So the well, I'll just list a couple more quotes quickly to give a sense of how these Soviet bloc folklorists were thinking about uh, this question of the value of folklore in the contemporary moment. At another one of these conferences, Soviet folklorist or cultural worker Vilora Kozlovskaya, she said, "The people cannot be simply a user of beauty, a spectator or a listener. It must be a creator, an originator of new cultural values. By uniting the immense masses into an organized collective, the folklore festival harnesses the thought and feelings of its participants." Um, and so this idea of harnessing is important, and we can discuss more of that perhaps in the discussion period, what it means to harness, but also be involving self-activity. And others would say things like that in a socialist society, we people will in any society that is organic and true, like socialism is moving towards, it will necessarily create forms resembling folk art. That's a quote from Hungarian folklorist Ivan Vitani. And Václav Frolec, a Czech folklorist, would say that there should be a synthesis of national and folk culture that can become a reality. And so all these, what they come together to say is something to the effect that even though folklore is changing, there's some movement from this traditional authentic folklore, that term also comes up in their discussions, towards folklorism, as Eva Klekot mentioned. There's also a kind of continuity and some motion towards a synthesis. And this synthesis can be understood as prefiguring a radically new form of participation in which, and a new kind of organization of cultural production. And so on the one hand, even though, now I'm getting close to the conclusion, even though certainly critics can question what kind of self-activity this is if it took place in the context of limited democratic rights and so many other respects. I think it's still important to see how important it was for communist thought to emphasize that self-activity, first of all, could be discussed and also could be experienced by people involved, to create a structure in which masses of people could feel that they were actively creating some kind of cultural values, again from the quote I mentioned earlier, and that when they then saw, even people who weren't directly involved, when they saw these representations of folklore, for example, if they went to a festival and saw it on stage, they could recognize this as something that they, as part of the people, had participated in creating. So for this kind of thing, I think folklore was not just not just useful as something to instrumentalize, but was an ideal medium that communist thought could take into account, especially in this period when folklore had become somewhat depoliticized after Stalin's death, depoliticized in an overt sense. The function of folklore was still important as a way of emphasizing this kind of mass participation. And there's a lot more that we could get into of how getting back to this idea of tragedy that Gorky mentioned, there are multiple realms, town and country, past and present. Folklore could again try to overcome these seemingly insurmountable separations, but we can maybe look a bit more at those problems, and also the problem of where maybe this ideal of participation also ran into its limits, where the specific problems were about what folklore as a mediator of participation, and where participation was not purely self-activity, was also organized and controlled activity in some ways. But maybe I would leave it there, so there is still time for discussion.